presentation for today's lecture, that is on high-rise building plumbing in the module of building plumbing. Okay, in the previous class we have discussed about the various plumbing systems for drinking water supply system and wastewater disposal system. We have discussed about those topics, and today I'll discuss about high-rise building plumbing. Now here, high-rise building, this term is used as the buildings which are more than two-story. Because why in this regard high-rise building is building, this term is used for that, because the normal water supply pressure for from the different source, that is 8 to 12 meters, that is the normal water supply pressure that is given in the main water supply system. That pressure is 8 to 12 meter high, that is maybe 25 to 40 feet height. That much pressure is given in the water mains in water supply system, but this much of water pressure can give service only for two-storied building, not more than two-storied buildings. Okay, now for the buildings which are above two-storied building, for those some special system is required make make the need or make the requirement of water supply, and obviously the continuous water supply in those high-rise buildings. For that some special system is required, and the main system is the booster pressure booster system. This special system, I should bold the term pressure booster system, is required for those high-rise buildings which are more than two-story. And this kind of pressure booster system is also used in some places of hilly areas where the ground is not even and the elevation of different points at those areas are different, and in the higher elevation points obviously booster systems are required so that continuous water supply can be possible. Now, for the buildings of three-storied or more than three-storied buildings, these pressure booster systems are required, and you cannot install this kind of pressure booster system of your own, but you have to take some permission from the authority. From the government authority to install the pressure booster system, and for this purpose you have to you will be given a certificate or some permission letter so that you can install this pressure booster system in some specific residential buildings or some commercial buildings which are high rise, that means more than two story, more than two story. Okay, now why this certificate or permission is required is that when some pressure booster system is installed, obviously the pressure in the mains will be worked for that portion of no, that specific building, and in the other parts of that area the pressure which is given from the main supply that is reduced, and that's why the pressure, as the pressure reduced, the water supply in other parts of that area will be reduced. That's why if the certain authority is not having not having that knowledge that pressure booster system is installed in some parts of that area, they will not increase the pressure for whole area. That's why these kinds of information must be given to the authority, and that authority will give you the permission or the certificate to install the pressure booster system. This is the reason, and this is the process of installing pressure booster system. Now what is the function of pressure booster system is that pressure boosting system is actually increase the water pressure than the other parts of that area, and that pressure booster system is pressure booster system acts according to the principle of pump and the principle of gravity tank. Okay, and the simplest way of pressure boosting is to collect the water from the basement tank to the roof tank. That means when the water supply pressure is the required water supply pressure is there in the supply main, then water is collected from that main line, and that water is collected in the roof tank. Okay, another way of pressure boosting system is that uh, this one, hydro pneumatic pressure tank. This type of tank may be installed to boost the pressure. These are the way of pressure boosting. And hydro pneumatic tank is nothing but after collecting the water in the root tank, that root tank in that root tank actually hydro pneumatic pump or a hydro pneumatic tank, that root tank is hydro pneumatic tank pressure tank, and this pressure tank is use the captive air pressure. That means in the line from that type of tank there will be some low or zero pressure point. Zero pressure point means obviously the pressure is low than the pressure at the roof tank, and that's why water will flow from the higher pressure to the lower pressure. And this kind of hydro pneumatic tank will provide adequate drinking water supply, and obviously that water supply will be continued. But this kind of hydropneumatic pressure tank should be should have the size of adequate for that building, for the number of residents of that building. And the most common process usually taken nowadays to boost the water pressure is the installation of booster pump set, which consists the multiple staged pump or variable speed pumps. That means special or the extra pumps are installed after or to collect the pump to collect the water from the main line. Extra pumps are installed. This is the common process used nowadays. And mm, from the storage tank or the main supply pipe, that pump will collect water to fill the roof tank. And in that process single or multi-stage pump set may be installed in different points of the high-rise building. And okay, these are the way by which we can boost or we can increase the water pressure, as the supply main water pressure is not adequate to meet the requirement of those high rise buildings. We have to boost or we have to increase the water pressure to meet the adequate pressure to give the service in the high rise buildings. Now this part I have discussed, that is some written approval should be taken, obviously must be taken, not should be, must be taken from the appropriate authority before installing the booster pumps. And obviously this legal process is done so that the appropriate authority having the knowledge that booster pumps are already installed in that some parts of that area, and they will meet they will keep the adequate pressure in the peak hours of the day or peak hours of the month, so that other area will not affected due to installing the booster pumps in certain areas. Okay, this is the basic principles or intro of the boosting pumps or boosting pressure in those high rise buildings. Now, as we are installing boosting pressure pumps, we have to construct a storage tank in the roof or in some high elevation point of that high rise building. Now, uh, booster pumps, the function of booster pump is only increase the pressure in some specific point of time or at some specific points of pressure, sorry, the supply line. But if there is no collection point, obviously that booster pump cannot uh, give the solution of the discontinuous water supply. That's why the after installing booster pump, we have to construct some storage tank, so that those collected water, those are collected from the supply main, that will be collected in some part of the building. And after constructing this kind of storage tank, uh, we have to ensure that the pressure is adequate to fill the storage tank. That means after installing the booster pump, we can use the pressure booster pump for some specific time of day, and at that time we have to completely fill the storage tank, so that in other time if the booster pump is not working, then also water can be supplied in the different parts of the building. And as we are collecting water for whole whole high-rise building, we have to ensure that there is adequate water in the main supply and adequate pressure in the main supply in that portion of the time. And accordingly we have to construct the storage tank, so that extra water or the stagnation of water can be avoided. Because if we construct a high sized or oversized storage tank, then after daily use of water, some portion of water will be stagnant in that storage tank, and that water, that collection of that water, the pressure and the use of pressure boosting pump, that much of energy is wasted, and this much of water has actually wasted. That's why we have to design the storage tank economically according to the requirement of that high rise building. Now coming to the pressure reducing valves. Now the question is that we are installing pressure boosting pump. Now we are talking about pressure reducing pump in pressure reducing valves. Now why these pressure reducing valves are used if there is some pressure boosting pumps are installed, because by pressure boosting pumps pressure is increased, and obviously the name pressure reducing valves itself suggests that pressure is reduced. Now the reason is very basic, because after collecting water in the storage tank, when the stored water or collected water is supplied in the different points of use, then in the higher floors of the high rise building the pressure is may be adequate. If the pressure is adequate in the higher parts of the building, then obviously in the lower parts of the building the pressure is very high, because as the water is flowing downwards the pressure will be increased as the height of each floor is increasing. As the water is flowing downwards, the water passes each floor, obviously 1 unit of height means the height of each floor will increase, and due to that increase of pressure the fittings and the pipeline may be affected or may be harmed due to the over pressure of the water. That's why for the lower floors of the high-rise building, we have to use pressure reducing valves so that over pressure or high pressure can be reduced to avoid the harm of the pipelines and the fittings of the plumbing system. And that's why we have to use the pressure reducing valves. And to install the pressure reducing valves, first of all we have to keep in our mind that in the middle floors, maybe if the building is 10 storied, obviously the upper three stories or upper three floors are having adequate pressure. Lower that means middle three stories having high pressure, and lowest four stories having very high pressure. That's why obviously the pressure increment is not similar in all the floors. That's why you have to divide the building into different zones of pressure. Maybe the common way to dividing into zones is to divide the buildings according to three floors. That means if the building is of 10 floors or 12 floors, then there will be four zones. The last three floors are having adequate pressure, next lower three floors having higher pressure than the upper floors. According to this, the lowest three floors will be having very high pressure, and according to the zoning, each zone one pressure reducing valve is installed to control the pressure for that zone, for that three floors. This is how zoning and pressure reducing valves are installed. And according to the position of the floors, the pressure is controlled to make the adequate to meet the required or adequate pressure in that zone. And that is how that in that zone or in that those specific floors the adequate pressures are given, and obviously continuous water supplies also uh, can be done. And in the lowest floors obviously the pressure is very high, and pressure reducing valve by pressure reducing valve we have to reduce a high portion of water pressure, so that water pressure cannot harm or cannot affect the pipeline and the fittings. and obviously for the lower floors these pressure reducing valves are very much effective. Now coming to the next part of this lecture, that is the brake pressure tank. Now brake pressure tank is used to control the pressure in the pipelines. Now what is the principal working principle of pipelines or pipe fittings actually? That is uh, due to water flowing through the pipes, hydrostatic pressure is exerted on the walls of the pipes. In case of high-rise buildings, the same principle of pressure reducing valves, the in the lower floors, hydrostatic pressure is very high, and that may exceed the allowable working pressure of pipes. And for those cases, to break the hydrostatic pressure, some tanks may be constructed specially, that is specially constructed in that zones. Those are called break pressure tank or BPT for this case. And the function of brake pressure tank is similar to the pressure reducing valve. Pressure reducing valve is working on the principle of the controlling the pressure, and the brake pressure tank, the working principle of brake pressure tank is nothing but to discharge the water in those tanks in some floor, maybe in the seventh or eighth floor in a 12-story building. A brake pressure tank is installed and water is discharged in that tank freely. That means there is no extra pressure in the environmental pressure, the water is discharged, and so that the pressure will be zero in that brake pressure tank. And when the water will be discharged from that brake pressure tank, obviously the water is not higher than the roof tank installed at the 12th story or 12th floor. By that you may install one another brake pressure tank in maybe fourth or fifth floor. In that floor also water will be discharged freely. That means there is no extra pressure. As the water is discharging freely in that tank, in that point itself the water pressure will be reduced to normal pressure. High pressure in the lower floors, this phenomena is occurred when the water is continuing to flow through the floors. If that continuous flow is broken by installing brake pressure tank, then only the pressure at that brake pressure tank will be normal or will be zero. And when the water is supplied from those brake pressure tank, the adequate pressure will be there in those user points, but higher pressure cannot be generated. Yes. Similar to the pressure reducing valves, this brake pressure tank may be installed or may be constructed in the different levels of the high-rise buildings, or maybe dividing the building in different zones. Brake pressure tanks may be installed in for each zones. Okay, this is the working principle of brake pressure tank, and this is all about the building plumbing system for high-rise building. And there are the concept of high-rise building, or why the special treatment is done for high-rise building plumbing. And in the next part, boosting water pressure boosting system, and how this pressure boosting system is worked, that is given. And in the next part, storage tank. What is storage tank? A simple construction. Storage tank is a very simple construction to collect the water from the supply main or the reservoir, ground reservoir, underground reservoir maybe. In the next parts, that is pressure reducing valve and the brake pressure tanks, these are the two way to control the high pressure in the lower floors of the high-rise building. These two are actually special installation for high-rise buildings. These two uh, systems are not required in the one story or two story buildings, but these two installations are specially required for the high rise buildings, because uh, as the water pressure is very high at the lower portion of the buildings or lower floors of the building, as the storage tank is at very high elevation point. Okay, so this is all about plumbing system in the high-rise buildings. Now, if you have any query, any question regarding this, you may ask.